It wasn't the horse that scared them, it was her. The men at Keller Creek Ranch had seen plenty of things they couldn't explain. A drought that lasted 3 summers, a barn fire that started with no lightning, a dog that found its way home across 200 kilometers of open Alberta prairie. But they had never seen a woman step off a supply truck in the middle of October, look out at 40 frozen acres of nothing, and smile like she'd just arrived somewhere she'd been trying to reach her whole life. Her name was Simone Audet. She was 26 years old, French-Canadian by blood, from a small town east of Montreal, where her grandfather had kept horses on land that flooded every spring and dried to cracked earth every August. She had her grandmother's patience and her father's stubbornness, and when she stepped down from that truck with one canvas bag over her shoulder and mud already on her boots, neither of those qualities was visible on her face. What was visible was something quieter, something the men couldn't name and therefore didn't trust.
The ranch belonged to a man named Victor Hale. He was 53, widowed, built like a fence post, and about as talkative.
He'd placed the advertisement in a regional agriculture paper, not for a bride, not exactly, but for someone willing to work in exchange for room and board and a small wage. Someone who understood livestock. Someone his foreman had joked privately, who wasn't afraid of Cinder. Cinder was the reason the last 3 workers had left before the end of their first week. He was a black Percheron cross, 17 hands, with a scar that ran from his left shoulder down to his knee. No one knew exactly where the scar came from. Victor had purchased him 4 years ago from an estate sale 2 provinces over, and the paperwork that came with the horse said only that he was difficult to handle. That was like saying the North Saskatchewan River was difficult to swim. Cinder had put 2 grown men in the hospital.
He had shattered a gate, broken a stall wall, and once stood perfectly still in the center of his paddock for 6 hours that a young ranch hand named Dex had called the vet thinking the horse was dying. The vet arrived. Cinder looked at him. The vet left without getting out of his truck.
Nobody rode Cinder. Nobody got close to Cinder. He ate his feed and drank his water and moved around his paddock like a storm that hadn't decided where to land yet. Victor kept him because selling him felt wrong and putting him down felt worse. So Cinder stayed, and every hand on the ranch learned within their first week to walk around the far side of the barn. Simone learned this on her second day. On her first day, she unpacked her single bag, met the other 2 ranch hands. A quiet man in his 50s called Walt, and a younger man named Dex who still flinched whenever a door slammed, ate supper in the main kitchen without talking much, and went to bed early. Victor watched all of this from across the table and said nothing. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. Something louder, maybe. Something that required more managing. On her second morning, she was up before anyone else. Walt found her standing at the paddock fence at 5:20, watching Cinder in the gray pre-dawn light.
"You shouldn't be out here," Walt said. "I'm not in there," Simone said. "I'm out here."
Walt looked at her. He was a man who had learned over many decades when to argue and when not to. He went inside and made coffee and said nothing to Victor about what he'd seen, but he watched the clock. Simone stood at that fence for 40 minutes. She didn't speak. She didn't hold out her hand. She didn't try anything that would appear, from the outside, to be a gesture of connection. She simply stood there in the cold, her breath fogging in front of her face, and watched the horse move.
Cinder moved away from her immediately. That was expected. But he didn't bolt to the far end of the paddock.
He moved about 15 feet and stopped.
Stood. Watched her back.
She came back the next morning.
And the one after that.
By the end of the first week, Victor had noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. That wasn't his way. But at dinner on Friday he said, more to the table than to anyone at it, that the northwest fence line needed checking before the snow hit, and he needed someone who could ride. "I can ride," Simone said. Victor looked up. "What horses have you handled?" "Draft crosses, mostly. My grandfather had 2 Belgian mares. One of them was herd sore and bit everything that came within a meter. Took me 2 winters to get a halter on her without a fight."
Dex, across the table, looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. Victor nodded once. "Walt'll take you out on Breda tomorrow. She's steady." Simone said that would be fine. She rode well. Better than Walt expected, and Walt had high expectations.
She had a seat like someone who'd grown up on horseback. Light hands, no drama. When Breda spooked at a jackrabbit along the east fence line, Simone didn't grab for the reins. She just sat back slightly, breathed, and waited for the mare to settle. Breda settled in about 4 seconds flat. Normally that took 2 minutes and a lot of talking. Walt told Victor that evening that the new woman could ride.
Victor said he'd noticed. What Victor hadn't said,
what he couldn't quite find the language for, was that he'd also noticed what she did every morning before the sun came up. He'd started waking earlier himself, which he didn't examine too closely. Standing at his bedroom window in the dark with a mug of coffee he didn't taste, watching a small figure stand at the paddock fence in the cold. Watching Cinder, who had not willingly approached a human being in 4 years,
stand 15 feet away and do something Victor could only describe as considering. In the third week, the distance became 12 feet. In the fourth week, Simone started talking, not to anyone else, to the horse.
low and steady, in a mixture of English and Quebecois French that she wasn't even fully aware she was using, the language slipping back into her the way it always did when she was tired or cold or concentrating on something hard. Her grandfather had spoken to his horses in French.
She'd absorbed that without meaning to, the way children absorb everything, not as a lesson but as a way of being.
She talked about the weather, about the shape of the clouds over the foothills, about a letter she'd gotten from her mother and hadn't answered yet. She talked about nothing, really.
The content didn't matter.
What mattered was the sound, the consistency of it, the lack of demand in it. She wasn't asking Cinder for anything. She was simply present, and she was making sound, and the sound was not accompanied by ropes or halters or the smell of fear. Cinder moved to 10 feet. Dex noticed before Victor did, because Dex was the one who fed in the mornings and had started timing his own arrivals differently to avoid crossing paths with the fence. One morning, he came around the corner of the barn and stopped so fast he nearly dropped the feed bucket.
Cinder was standing approximately 8 feet from the fence.
Simone was standing on the other side of it. Neither of them was moving.
Dex set the bucket down very slowly and went back the way he'd come.
He mentioned it to Walt.
Walt already knew.
Neither of them mentioned it to Victor, because somehow mentioning it felt like it might break something. Victor found out on his own, the way he found out most things. He came around the barn before dawn one morning with every intention of checking the water heater in the south stall, and he stopped in the shadow of the barn wall because Simone was at the fence and Cinder was 6 feet away, and something in the air between them was so specific and so fragile that Victor literally did not breathe for almost a full minute. He went back inside. He didn't check the water heater. He sat at the kitchen table and drank cold coffee and thought about his wife, which he hadn't done in a long time. Not because he'd stopped missing her, but because missing her had become something he carried quietly rather than looked at directly. His wife had been the one who understood animals. She'd been the one who sat with the dogs when they were sick, who knew which cow was about to have trouble calving, who talked to the horses in a low voice that nobody else could hear. He hadn't thought about that in years. He thought about it now. 3 things happened in week 6.
The first, Cinder ate a piece of carrot from Simone's palm.
He didn't do it gracefully. He reached out, considered it for a long moment with the kind of deliberate skepticism that made Simone's arm ache from holding still,
then took the carrot so quickly that she felt his breath on her wrist and flinched slightly.
Not from fear, but from the sheer electric surprise of it. She didn't make a sound.
Her eyes went bright. She stood there with her empty hand against the fence rail
and let out a long, slow breath that took most of the tension in her body with it. She told no one, but she was smiling when she came in for breakfast, and Walt, who noticed most things, noticed that. The second thing, Victor asked Simone to stay on past the original agreement.
He did this badly.
He brought it up at the end of a conversation about the south pasture drainage, as though it were a logistical footnote. She was looking at a fence post map and didn't look up right away, and in the silence that followed he felt, for the first time in many years, like he might have said the wrong thing. Then she said, "I was hoping you'd ask." He nodded. He went back to looking at the drainage map. Neither of them said anything else about it, but the temperature in the room changed in a way that both of them felt and neither acknowledged. The third thing was harder. Dex's younger brother arrived unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon, passing through on his way to a job up north.
His name was Cameron, and he was 22,
and he had not yet learned the particular skill of reading a room, or a paddock. He'd heard about Cinder the way everyone heard about Cinder, as a kind of legend, the horse no one could touch, and legends to 22-year-olds are a challenge rather than a warning. Walt saw him heading toward the paddock and called out. Cameron waved without turning around. What happened next was fast and not as bad as it could have been, but bad enough. Cameron vaulted the fence, actually vaulted it, which nobody had done before because nobody had been that stupid, and Cinder reacted the way 4 years of trauma reacted, immediately, completely, from a dead standstill to a full rear in about 1 second. Cameron scrambled back over the fence fast enough to avoid the hooves, but caught his shoulder on the top rail going over and hit the ground hard on the other side. Simone was across the yard in seconds. Not toward Cameron, toward the paddock. She put both hands on the fence rail and spoke. Low, steady, the French-English murmur that Cinder had been hearing every morning for 6 weeks. The horse was at the far end of the paddock, sides heaving, nostrils wide. He turned his head toward her. She kept talking. It took 11 minutes. Victor timed it without meaning to. 11 minutes of her voice in the cold afternoon air, not asking anything, not demanding anything, just being there and being consistent. The most powerful thing, it turned out, that a person could offer an animal that had learned to expect the worst. Cinder walked toward the fence, not all the way.
He stopped about 8 feet out, the way he always did.
But he stopped. He wasn't running anymore.
Victor looked at his foreman. His foreman looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. Cameron's shoulder was bruised but not broken. He was quiet at supper. He apologized to Simone, which surprised her slightly. She said she appreciated it. She also said, without sharpness, that Cinder's history wasn't written on the fence for people to read because nobody knew it,
but that the way an animal acted was usually a record of what had been done to it, and that deserved some respect. Cameron ate the rest of his meal in silence. He left the next morning. Dex apologized separately. Simone told him it wasn't his fault. Things between Victor and Simone shifted after that, slowly and without announcement. They started spending time in the same space that wasn't strictly about work, not by design, exactly, but the ranch had a rhythm, and their rhythms had started to align. He fixed the hinge on the tack room door that she'd mentioned in passing. She started making enough coffee for 2 without thinking about it. Small things. The kind of things that don't look like anything from the outside. One evening in early December, when the temperature had dropped enough that their breath made clouds indoors as well as out, Victor found her in the barn after supper, checking the water buckets.
"You've been doing that every night," he said. "I know," she said. "It's my job to do that. I know that too." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You don't have to take care of everything, you know."
Simone looked at him. It was the most direct thing he had said to her that wasn't about the ranch, and something in it caught her off guard.
Not unpleasantly. "I'm not trying to take care of everything," she said. "I just don't like knowing something needs doing and not doing it." Victor was quiet for a moment. "That's going to wear you out eventually."
"Probably," she said. "It hasn't yet." He almost smiled. She saw it. She looked back at the water bucket so he wouldn't see her see it. The morning it happened, the temperature was -14. Simone was at the paddock fence at her usual time.
She had a soft rope halter looped over her shoulder, not in her hands, not visible. She'd been carrying it for 3 days. She wasn't going to use it that day. She'd told herself that clearly. It was just present. An idea, not a plan. She stood and talked. The same low, wandering monologue she'd been delivering for 8 weeks. She told Cinder about the ice on the water troughs, about the letter from her mother she'd finally answered, about what the sky had looked like the night before, when the northern lights came out for 20 minutes over the foothills. Cinder walked toward the fence, not 8 feet, not 6 feet. He walked to the fence and stopped and stood with his nose approximately 2 feet from her face. Simone did not move. Her heart was doing something specific and enormous in her chest that she would not be able to describe accurately to anyone later. She just stood there, breathed. The horse dropped his head slightly, just a few inches.
The way a horse drops its head when it decides, very quietly, that the threat level has dropped to something manageable.
"Okay," she said softly, "okay."
She did not reach out. She waited. And Cinder moved the remaining 2 feet on his own, pressing his nose lightly to the outside of her hand on the fence rail. She stood there for a long time after that. Not because anything else was going to happen that morning. It wasn't.
But because the moment was complete in itself and deserved to be felt fully before it passed.
Victor saw all of it from the kitchen window. He set down his coffee mug, which had gone cold without him noticing, and stood very still for a moment.
He thought about calling out to Walt. He didn't. This felt like something that belonged to Simone, and maybe to the horse, and he wasn't going to put himself in the middle of it.
He thought about his wife again.
About how she used to say that trust wasn't something you built, it was something you revealed. That it was already there, in everything, waiting for the conditions to come right. He'd thought that was poetic nonsense when she said it. He'd never told her that. He thought maybe she'd been right.
The day Simone led Cinder out of the paddock for the first time was a Tuesday in late December, 3 days before Christmas, with about 4 inches of new snow on the ground and a sky so pale and bright it looked like something polished. She used the halter she'd been carrying for 3 weeks.
She opened the gate slowly, and Cinder walked through it like he'd been doing it his whole life, which may be in some version of his history before the scar and the fear he had.
Walt was standing by the barn. Dex was standing next to him. Both of them were quiet.
The kind of quiet that isn't empty,
that's full of something that doesn't need to be said out loud to be understood. Victor came out of the house when he heard nothing, which sounds wrong but was right. The ranch was usually never quiet at that hour, and the silence pulled him to the window and then to the door. She walked Cinder in a slow circle around the paddock exterior. No drama, no performance. Just a woman and a horse moving together through new snow, their breath making the same clouds in the cold air. Victor leaned against the porch railing and watched. He didn't know exactly when things had changed between them. Whether it was the drainage map conversation, or the coffee that was always there in the morning, or the night he'd stood in the barn doorway and said more than he'd meant to, it had probably been accumulating for a long time, the way most real things accumulate. Quietly, without announcement, until one morning you look out a window and realize that the shape of your days is different than it was before someone arrived. And that different has become something you don't want to be without. Simone brought Cinder back to the gate and led him through, and removed the halter, and stood with her hand on his neck for a moment. Not patting, just resting there. Cinder didn't move away. She latched the gate and turned and saw Victor watching. She held his gaze for a moment.
Then she looked at Walt and Dex and said, "He's going to need a different name." Walt blinked. "What?" "Cinder, the name's from before. He's different now."
She looked back at the horse.
"Something to do with the snow, maybe. Or the light."
He walked out into both of them this morning like they weren't something to be afraid of. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Dex said quietly, "Winter?" Simone looked at the horse. The horse stood in the snow with his ears forward, looking at nothing in particular, looking like an animal that had decided, somewhere in the last 8 weeks, to believe in the possibility of something different.
"Winter," she said.
"Yeah." Victor pushed off the porch railing and walked toward the paddock. He stopped a few feet from where Simone was standing. He looked at the horse, at Winter, for a moment.
"Good name," he said. "It fits," she said. He nodded. He almost said something else.
Instead, he looked at the pale December sky, and then back at her, and something passed between them that didn't need words and wouldn't have been improved by them. The kind of thing that arrives slowly and without ceremony.
The way trust arrives, the way snow arrives.
So quietly that by the time you notice it, the whole landscape has already changed.